With the exercises we've done up to this point, we know how to create a program and get them running, how to read a file, write a output to another file, and so now we're going to do a little bit more with data manipulation. And a lot of these techniques we've already done in the spreadsheet section, so we're just going to do some similar things. And the first thing we're going to do is extract a substring from a line. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to ask for criteria. We're going to use that same data file. Let's pull that data file up again, real basic. So we're going to ask for a criteria, which is going to be a city. Let's say they choose Los Angeles. What we're going to do is find that row first of all, and then we're going to extract the state and just return the state. Let's say we just want to know the state. We don't want all the other information. So once we find the row that we're going to work with, what we're going to do is find the beginning point, which is a comma. We're going to find the end point, which we'll just find by looking at the total length of that line, and then we're going to extract from here to here. And so the output should just be the state, not the whole line. So that's our intention. We're going to use a couple functions, the find and the length function, to do that. And these are the three main things that we need. Once again, the criteria we'll get from the user, and then once we have that criteria, we'll find the line to work with. We'll identify the beginning point and then the end point, and then we'll extract between the two. The code is very much the same. Here is where you'll see a lot of the differences, and here's where we find method, actually in this case, or it's the function to return a position wherever we find a comma. And in this case, we know our data. We know that there's only one comma in that line, so we can just say find that comma, and we'll know that that defines, it almost defines the beginning point. Because we have a space, or we want to move over one more space, we add one, because otherwise it'll extract the comma as well. So what we want to do is find that position and then add one to move it over just one more place, and that way it'll start at the beginning of the state name instead of extracting the comma as well. We define the end by saying what's the total length of that line. So if there's, say, 15 characters, then the end will be 15. If the comma was found at space 8, it'll add 1 and begin extracting at space 9 or position 9. Finally, we will extract the line and we'll give it the beginning and end to define our state. So once again, here is the code that we just saw in the reference guide. Let's go ahead and run it. So it says name a city and find the corresponding state. So in this case, we'll put in, say, Los Angeles. Okay, and in this, in the code, what I did is just to be helpful, I printed out the var begin place, the var end position, and then the actual value of the state. Now this is useful to do. Let me go back to the code here. This is useful to do if you are trying to troubleshoot, or you're trying to understand what values are being returned along the way. So for a final product, I would probably comment out these lines. So having these extra print statements in can be very helpful in determining what values the variables have at this point in time. So by doing that, you know what the beginning position is, what the end, and then the final value that you extract. So you'd want to do this maybe when you're building the code, and for the final product you just wanted to comment out those extra print statements. In the last section we were able to extract a substring, but sometimes the data is constructed properly enough that we can divide the data up by a certain delimiter, such as a comma. So in a comma separated field or a file, you can use the comma as a, say, field separator, and you can then split those fields or those columns up by that delimiter. And so let me show you what we're going to do here. I'll bring up the data, And it's really pretty much the same data set we've been using, but I renamed it to data32.csv, and all I did is add an additional column or an additional field out here called abbreviation, and I gave the abbreviation of each state. So now instead of having 2 fields, we have 3. And what the idea is we're going to split up these columns by the comma. So we'll have basically 3 columns. The first one being city, the second being state, and the third being abbreviation. And then we're going to extract only the city and the abbreviation. We're going to reassemble it by a comma and then output it to a new file. We'll also print it to the screen so you see it quicker. And so this is one way we can manipulate the data, and just with a few quick, just a few short lines, we can then reconstruct a new file. So let's go back and look at the code again here in the reference guide. The only thing that's really going to change is down here. And the key part here is that we take our var line. So we're reading, once again, we're opening the file and reading through each line. We take our line and we split it. And what do we split on? In this case, it's a comma because we have a comma separated file. If this could be a semicolon, a colon, a pipe, whatever symbol is used to delineate or separate the fields is what we could use here. So in this case, it's a comma. Once we do that, then we're going to have our data structured in an index, and the index starts at 0. So even though this is column 1 right here, this would be referred to as index 0, and then the second column would be index 1, and the third column index 2. So that can be a little bit confusing, but if you put in a value here and you don't get what you're expecting, then you'll know that you may have to adjust your index number. So let's see here. Okay, so we're going to extract the first column and the third column. We're going to reassemble it with a comma in between, and then we're going to put that out to a new file. And so this is one way we can manipulate the data to take a bigger set and manipulate it down to a set that is more useful to us, or like I said, someone else who might be wanting to use that data. I think that's all I had to show you here, so let's just go ahead and run the code. Okay, same code here, and run it. And now it didn't ask us for any input this time because we weren't looking to extract a certain line. We weren't filtering out the rows. In this case, we were filtering on a column. And so it just ran the code for the whole file. And so now you can see we've gotten rid of the states as it was spelled out, and now we're left with the city and the abbreviation. So this is another way that you can manipulate the data. What we've been doing up to this point is really filtering out different rows in the data, and now in this case we're filtering out a column. And really what we did is we broke it apart and we reassembled it the way we wanted. And so this is just another technique of being able to manipulate data in a form that is more useful to you. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about regular expressions. I mentioned this before earlier and said that they were similar to wildcards, but regular expressions or regexes give you a lot more flexibility and power when you're looking for a certain criteria. Not only can you search for a specific word, but you can also search for patterns. And so this is going to give us a lot of capabilities. And even though regular expressions as a whole is beyond the scope of this course, I think it's important enough to learn a few things so that you can have the flexibility and the power with just a few simple characters. So let's take a look at some of those characters. A caret here represents the beginning of a line. So when we were in our command line in Unix or in Linux, we could grep and then search for something that began with an F. So this caret represents begins with. So if something begins with whatever we put here and then followed up with anything, it will find and return it. Conversely, if we use a $sign at the end, it will look for anything that ends in whatever we tell it here. So the CSV with the $ means find anything that ends in CSV. So if we're looking for all of our CSV files, we could use that. The $* basically stands for anything. And we'll look at that in just a second. A period matches any character at that position. So whether it be a number, a special character, a letter, anything, it would match anything at that one specific position. A star would be repeated over many positions, and so a $, which is very common, matches any character at any position. And that's why here this $* could represent 1 or 2 or 200 characters, and it would any file name ending in CSV would be found in this case. So $* is used quite a bit. It's something to be familiar with. Now if we didn't want to use the special meaning, like say we actually wanted to find a $, we could escape the special meaning by using a / in front of it. So if we put $, it would no longer mean at the end of something, it would mean an actual $. Finally, if we use square brackets, we can search for any character that happens to be within those brackets. So this comes in handy when you're looking for, say, a word that you're not sure if it's uppercase or lowercase. So you're looking for the word, so a word that starts with A, and you're not sure if it's in uppercase or lowercase. You can use these brackets and put an uppercase A and a lowercase a, and so it will match anything that happens to have an upper or lowercase. So this is, you can use this for many different uses, but that would be a popular one to use it for. Now finally, like I mentioned, regular expressions are beyond the scope of this course, but a few techniques will provide you with a lot of flexibility and power, and so I want to just at least introduce the concepts and give you a few tools to work with here. But I would highly recommend and suggest that you follow up and learn a little bit more about regular expressions, because again, it can help you when you're programming in Python, when you're working in Linux, or even in Windows if you're working with PowerShell. Now we'll do an exercise using regular expressions, and we'll start off with a data file that looks similar to this. You just have a name, a phone number, email, and state. And what you'll notice here is that there's some patterns. So phone numbers will have maybe 3 digits, a dash, 3 digits, a dash, and then 4 digits. An email address would have the @ symbol here, and with something in front and behind. So we can use those key points when searching for certain information. Once again, I would recommend that you maybe look through this video and then try it yourself, or vice versa, whatever you're comfortable with. But you can either copy the code out of the reference guide or type it in manually. As you see, the code is starting to get a little bit longer because we're doing a little bit more. And a couple things to notice here is the functionality that's built into the default Python is not necessarily all the code that is available. So it only gives you just enough to get you started. But if you do need to, well, there's a lot more functionality out there, and in order to make use of that functionality, you have to import these extra modules. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later, but for now, just make sure that this statement is in your code, where you're going to import RE, which stands for regular expression. And a lot of this code up top is very similar, all the way down to here, where we use this split function or method to separate out the data file into index value or index components or separate fields. So the data file we have here looks like this, where it's each component or each field is separated by a comma. So we used the split function on the comma to separate out those fields. We've seen that already, but what you haven't seen so far is this down here. So this section here, again, we're going to iterate through each line of the file. So you've seen that, but this is where the code changes a little bit. see if I can highlight this for you. So we're going to do a few different things. In the first case, we're going to match two characters that are uppercase, and that is representing the state. So if we match two characters, and again, this is where that bracket notation came into. In this case, instead of just adding a single letter, we're saying anything through A through Z that's in all caps. And if we see that once, this stands for basically one position. This stands for the second position. So if we see anything A through Z, and there's two positions that have that meet that criteria, then we're going to say that we found a state. The second thing we're going to do is look for a phone number. So if we match, and again we're going to use this function here, re.match. So this is the regular expression object. This is the method that we're going to use, and what we're going to do is match these this pattern. And so you can see it's kind of long and looks kind of redundant, but what we're doing is saying any number between 0 and 9, and we want 1 position, 2 position, 3 position. Then we're looking for a dash and 1 position, 2 position, 3 position, and a dash, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 positions. So if we find that pattern, then we're going to say we found a phone number. And finally, we're going to look for an email. And in this case, we're just going to assume that there's this @ symbol is only found in the email. So if we find something that begins with anything, has an @ symbol, and then ends in anything, we're going to assume that's an email address, and we're going to extract that. So again, it's once you understand the this little bit of code here, you'll be able to do a lot more and build in a lot more flexibility. So let's go ahead and take a look now at the data set and the code. Once again, here's the data set. Very simple. I just created it. You can create something very similar on your own. And here is the code in the Python editor. And maybe one other thing we didn't look at before was these if and then elif. So what we're doing is we're saying if this, do this, else if this condition, then do this, and then else if this condition, do this. So for each line it's going to do that, and in this case we really only have 1 or 2 lines. Let's go ahead and run it and see what comes back. Okay, so it found a phone number and it properly identified it because of the pattern: 3 numbers, a dash, 3 numbers, a dash, 4 numbers. Also identified the email address by looking for something that had the @ symbol, and it also found a state because it just found 2 uppercase letters. So again, the code is getting a little more complicated, but hopefully you can see that it was still fairly simple for the power that you would have. So if you had a list of, say, 5,000 rows of data that was made up of names and email addresses and that type of thing, you can use this regular expression pattern or this regular expression function to be able to quickly extract and filter and slice and dice your data to get it into a format that you want. Or you could read through a big file just pulling out email addresses if you wanted to. So a lot of power, a lot of flexibility in using regular expressions, and I would again highly encourage you to make use of regular expressions in your coding. The next thing we'll do is clean up what's called white space, and we did this before in Excel, where we basically use some techniques to strip out white space from either the left or the right of a particular word. And what this really is doing is taking away things like spaces, tabs, new line feeds, things like that. Things really, there's characters there that you can't see, and sometimes when you're dealing with data you want to clean all that up because you don't want that as part of your data. You might get some preceding spaces in the data or spaces that are at the end, and that can cause problems. So it's better to clean all that up when you're extracting data and repackaging it. So we use these commands here, and I believe these are very similar to what was used in Excel, where we use these strip commands. And down here we can essentially just take everything away, or if we wanted to target a specific type of white space, like a space, a tab, a carriage return, then we could use these symbols as well. So in the next exercise, we're going to look at a data file that has some extra spaces in it, and like I said, it's kind of exaggerated just for the exercise, but it's a good technique and it's useful for cleaning up your data. Let's move on to an exercise where we can now practice extracting that white space, and in this case we see our data file here. We're going to use data34.txt, and what's in it is this information, but as you'll notice, there's some extra spaces at the end of this first field, some spaces before the phone number, and then spaces before and after the email. So we've just kind of thrown in some extra spaces to kind of highlight this point, is that you may or may not be able to tell if there's like one space or something like that. In this case, you can see there's probably 2 or 3 spaces. But let's move down to the code and I'll point a few things out. First of all, I've added in a dot star here so that if there is anything before the state or the phone number, it will find it. We already had that for the email. So this will allow us to search for anything where there might be some extra spaces in front, and then the 2 uppercase letters for the state. Same thing with the phone number, before and after. We're allowing there to be anything before and after this sequence of criteria. Okay, the other thing I wanted to point out is when we print out the state or the phone number or the email, we're going to use this method here called strip. And so instead of just printing out this whole var item, which would have been, remember the var item is going to split things at the comma, or we've already split this into by the comma, and so this whole part will be extracted and printed. When we use strip, it's going to take away the white space before and after, or wherever the white space is. If we only wanted to take away the spaces before, we could use lstrip, and if we only wanted to take the spaces after, we could use rstrip. But in this case, we want to take it from the left and right. Okay, so let's take a look at the code, and we'll just go ahead and run it. This is the same thing that was in the reference guide, so you can just copy and paste out of the reference guide, or you can type this out yourself. So what we see here is we see our email found, and it's maybe 1 or 2 spaces here, but that's what we had put into our code. We probably allowed a space after the colon here. Now if we go back and we run that same code with the code that we had before in code 33, we didn't have the dot strip method appended here when we printed it out. So what I did is I went up here and changed the data file to be data34. So we're going to run this file again, but without having that strip method, and we'll see the difference. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put those dot stars, because it may not find it. Now that there's some extra space, it may not find this criteria without modifying it slightly. Okay, and then I need to save this, and we'll run it. And what we see now is that it's pretty clear that there's some extra spaces here. This is when we used the strip method, and we can see it's lined up. And here we can see it's moved over slightly. Same thing with the phone number. We see that there must be some extra white spaces here. So when we use strip, it takes all that away. And that's the main thing for this lesson. It's a very useful tool, but again, you may want to make sure you include that method because you want to make sure that your data is as clean as possible, and if you have some extra spaces, it could cause problems later when you're maybe searching or putting it in a report. This is the last exercise we'll do in Python, but it's a very powerful skill to have, and we saw this already when we were working with spreadsheets, but we're just going to now do the same thing in Python, where we search for a word, we find it, and then we replace it. Now our data file in this case is very small, but if you have a very large data file, this would be very powerful in changing something in there and manipulating that data very quickly once you write the code. So here's our data file. Once again, it's just a name, phone number, email, and state. The main thing we need to pay attention to in this case is the replace method. A lot of this information we've already seen. These lines up here are just going to ask for input for the user or from the user. And here is the method that we're going to use. So once we find the line that we want to work with, we're going to search for an old word and replace it with a new word. All the rest of the code is code you've seen before. So let's go ahead and open up that file. So here's our data file, and when we run the code, it's going to ask for a few things. And once it gathers that information, first of all, it's going to ask for a word to find. So let's say we want to find all rows that contain New York. And then what we're going to do is replace the somewhere.com with somewhereelse.com. So that's what we're going to do. We want to find, we're going to ask for criteria of what row to find. And then within that row, we're going to ask what word do we want to replace, and then provide the word that we want to replace it with. And we just saw that code in the reference guide. Once again, you can just copy it or you can retype this. There's some extra comments in here to help you know what's going on, so you can type those comments if you want, but it's optional. Let's go ahead and just run it. So it says, what word do you want to find? So let me see if I can keep our data file available there. So we want to find New York. What old word? Somewhere.com. And we want to replace that with somewhere. Okay, so now we see our old line that had somewhere.com and our new line has somewhereelse.com. So this again is a very simple example with a very small data file, but imagine if you had thousands of lines and you needed to replace something, or you wanted to do that to manipulate the data to put it in a form that's more readable for yourself. Maybe you wanted to change everywhere that said New York and spell it out to NEW space YORK. This would be a great way to do that as well. The Python skills we've learned so far can get you a long way, but eventually you'll need to expand your capabilities. And so there's a few ways of doing that. You can import built-in modules, you can download and install third-party modules, or you can create your own custom module. Now fortunately, there are many modules that have already been created. You just have to know where to look to find them. So the first place to look is within Python itself. Now Python doesn't load all the code it has available to it. And it doesn't do that because it wouldn't make a lot of sense to load a bunch of code that it wasn't going to use from a resource standpoint. So Python actually has a lot more capabilities, and we'll take a look here in a second on how to find the additional modules that you can use. And when you find those modules, then you can just import them into your code directly. Alternatively, you could search for third-party modules. We'll talk about that as well. And if you find a reputable third-party module, you can download that, install it, and then import that code functionality as well. And finally, if you just don't find what you need, you can always write your own code module. So let's scroll down here a second and we'll take a look at how to find additional modules that are available within Python. So here's how we can do that. We can use this help with the modules and it will list different modules that we can use. So from the Python shell, just type in help. And as you'll see here in a second, there's quite a few modules that are already built into Python that you can use. To get help on a specific module, you can type in help again, and this time put in the module name. You can see there's quite a bit of information, and so what you'll see here, I guess I should expand this so it doesn't, a little easier to read here. So this is the name of the module, sys, and there's some documentation, a description, and then here's some things that it can do for you. So standard in, standard out, standard error, that's what prints to the screen or wherever you want to print it to. So anyways, you'll probably just have to read through it. There's some methods in here, some attributes or properties like version, some functions down here, just referenced. So all this functionality is at your disposal, and it takes a little while to try to figure it out. But if you see other examples, you'll probably it's probably the best way to learn this instead of just reading through all this information. You'll see some examples that other people have done, and then you can come back to these pages to understand it a little bit better. But there's no way you're going to be able to read all of this for every single module that's available. And finally, if you want to get some additional information about a particular attribute or method within that module, you can type in help, and then we're looking at the sys module right now, so we'll just do standard out, and once again you'll get a list of information that you can read about. So that's how you would find out, or how you get more information about a module that was already built in to Python. Additionally, you can get third-party modules, and you want to make sure they're reputable, but here's a few that you might be able to or that are reputable. And the way you would install these is, there's several different ways, but you can use pip install and then the module name once you've downloaded it. So here's some modules that are very popular with Python. There's pandas, numpy, scipy, etc. There's also, you can also download Anaconda, which is a bigger package that includes Python, but it also includes a lot of these third-party modules as well, and it's all bundled together. So that's another alternative or option for you. Finally, if you can't find code that works the way you want it to, you can always create your own custom code and write it. Now, these topics are beyond the scope of the course right now, but it's important that you're just aware that if you aren't able to do what you need to in Python, that you have all those avenues for expanding your capabilities.